Okay, we are now recording the meeting, and I'm very happy to have with us a dear friend and dear colleague, Marta D'Andrea. Marta received her PhD at the University Sapienza, the University of Rome, with the thesis on, please mute the microphone if you don't mind, because otherwise we have the okay. So I was saying that Marta received her PhD at the University Sapienza, the University of Rome, with a thesis published in 2015, which focused on the EB4 in the southern Levant. Actually, Marta has widely concentrated her research activities on the third millennium in the Levant, although quite recently, I could say she started to take on, to expand interest to include also the early second millennium in the Levant, a topic which is of my particular interest. And her focus, more in general, her field of research are dedicated to the study of pottery traditions, ceramic traditions in the Levant, early and the formation of early urban societies. Actually, Marta now is, although she's very young, but she's also very well known because she co-directs 3 different projects. The first one is the Lebanese Italian regional archaeological project in the region of Tyre. And the second is the expedition, the archaeological expedition to Khirbet Iskander in Jordan. And the third is the Madaba Regional Archaeological Museum project. So I'm very, very happy to have Marta with us because now she's a very well-distinguished, well-esteemed colleague, and above all, she is a super expert of the third millennium. So for us, it's a great chance to improve our knowledge, in this case, especially of the Jordan in the third millennium. And with this, I conclude, and I leave the online floor to Marta. Thank you again, and thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for your introduction, and a big thank you for having me as a presenter in the Levant 2023 session of the ARWA lecture series. And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where everybody's based, to everyone, and thank you for attending this talk. I hope everybody can hear me well, otherwise just let me know. So for today, I would like to discuss with you what are all problems in New Vista in the study of the early urbanization in the Levant, taking the point of view of Jordan, because as Marco just said, this is where my field research is based. And I would like to introduce you to the chronological and conceptual frameworks for this period and to current interpretative models for the Southern Levantine society during the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. Although we will be looking at the earliest developments in the 4th millennium BC, although very quickly, we will mostly concentrate on Jordan from the early Bronze II to early Bronze IV, that is from the end of the 4th through the 3rd millennium BC. And what I would like to discuss with you today is how Jordan fits into current big pictures narrative that have been drawn for the Southern Levant as a whole, and how recent research is changing the way we understand development and crisis of urbanism in Jordan in particular. Most of you will be well aware that there's been a revision of the Southern Levantine chronology for the early Bronze Age, and that higher absolute dates have been proposed and are now virtually unanimously accepted, that have moved the upper boundary of every phase of the early Bronze Age in the Southern Levant circa 200 years backward. And this started as part of the Archaean project, but later on, independent project that provided more data, more records that would support the revised absolute chronology. And with the expedition of Khirbet Iskander, we recently provided more data, the dates that support an earlier absolute chronology for the early Bronze 3-4 transition in the Levant, in the Southern Levant, for example. Likewise, many of you will know that the part of the Archaean project was also changing the archaeological periodization, moving away from the early Bronze Age terminology and adopting a new subphasing that replaces early Bronze Age 1, 2, 3, and 4 with a different terminology, that is the early Southern Levant terminology. Within this presentation, I will use the higher absolute chronologies. So whenever I refer to periods, I'm referring to the new chronological framework. But for the time being, I will retain the traditional early Bronze 1, 2, 3, and 4 periodization for the sake of clarity, for, let's say, a more general audience that is not deeply, that may not be deeply involved in the intricacies of the terminology and the subphasing of the Levantine early Bronze Age. Let's say, current regional narrative, wider regional narratives of the Southern Levantine early Bronze Age have been drawn initially mostly based on the record from Transjordan, and this is true especially for what concerns early Bronze 2 and 3. It is a little bit different from the early Bronze 4 period, because from the 70s and then increasing from the 1980s onward, Jordan yielded a huge record concerning the non-urban period. But let's say until some 20 years ago, regional narratives for the Southern Levantine early Bronze Age were basically drawn based on the record from Transjordan. So it is not an innovation since it's been 20 years, but let's say it's been from the last 20 years that Jordan has been fitted into the wider storytelling, let's call it this way, for the Southern Levantine Bronze Age. And in this slide, you see the array of publications that have gradually included Jordan in this narrative, so either based just on Jordan or fitting the region into more broader regional approaches. The conceptual background is basically the analysis of the development and then crisis of early urbanism during the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. Here you see traditional chronology and the traditional narrative for the early Bronze Age in the Southern Levant, a trajectory that would lead from the early Bronze 1A open villages to early Bronze 1B proto-urban villages, to early Bronze 2 and 3 urbanism, and then to a crisis and the reversion to a non-urban period during the early Bronze 4. And here you can see how this trajectory can be fitted into a different higher chronology. You see that some periods have been stretched, some others have shrunk, but basically in some studies the early Bronze Age trajectory for the region has been refitted into the new regional chronology. This is not the only narrative on the developments of economy and society in this region all through this very long time span. In fact, especially during the last decades, different scholars have interpreted and described the economy and society of the Southern Levant somewhat inconsistently on a scale from urbanism, from city-states to corporate rural communities, and different interpretative models are still used by different colleagues. Still in 2008, Graham Philip, in his chapter on Jordan, during the early Bronze 1 through 3, suggested that archaeologists should probably have posited a different form of urbanism, a quantitatively different form of urbanism, for which, and I'm quoting, the material correlates and conceptual frameworks have not yet been established, that have been more proficient, more useful to leave aside terms like urbanism, so that scholars would not refer to unspoken assumptions, as he called them, inherent to this term, that were referring to different socio-economic and socio-political systems like those of Mesopotamia or Syria. And still in 2014, Susan Richard, in her chapter dealing with Jordan in particular, in the framework of the Southern Levantine urbanization, maintained that it would have been the task for future research to determine more convincingly the scale of development, the scale of complexity reached by the Southern Levant and by Jordan in particular during the early Bronze Age. Anyway, every time that we consider or reconsider or approach the early Bronze Age of the Southern Levant and of Jordan, we are faced with the question posed by Meredith Chesson whether we are looking at urbanism, townism, or at something entirely different in this period, in this region. From my point of view, anticipating a little bit what I will be dealing with more in detail in the following part of this presentation, the answer to this question is yes. And actually, the notion that a general urbanizing trend was happening in the region from the very close of the 4th millennium BC through the early centuries of the 3rd millennium BC is now getting wider approval. Let's say that the pendulum of the theoretical frameworks for this period is swinging again toward urbanization, although framed still in the context of an emerging phenomenon, let's call it this way. It is, however, been suggested that from circa 2700 BCE to circa 2500 BCE, that would correspond to the later Early Bronze III, the first cycle of urbanism in the Southern Levant and in Jordan would came to an end, and that the region would transition to a non-urban socio-political structure and socio-economic organization during the last 5 centuries of the 3rd millennium BC and into the very early 20th century BC. So from circa 2500 to circa 1950 BC, the latter period would correspond to Early Bronze IV, also called the Intermediate Bronze Age. Current interpretations of this transition from the urban to the non-urban period in the region, at least part of current interpretations of this phenomenon, center on the notion of centrifugal movements of people away from the early cities towards pastoral milieus in the later Early Bronze III, and on the notion that pastoralists were vectors of culture and technological information from northern Syria, in Early Bronze IV, that reshaped the local material culture through foreign influences. On the other end, other scholars, such as Suzanne Richard, retained a model of rural complexity based on the notion of a permanence of urban-like traits in the Southern Levant during Early Bronze IV, especially at the permanent sedentary sites, and that a caliciform influx, an influx from the so-called caliciform culture of northern Syria, might have also been influential in such rural growth during the Early Bronze IV. With this background in mind, let's take a look at what is the archaeological record of the region during the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. As I said, we will be looking mostly at the 3rd millennium BC, but I think it is a good start to look at what happens, although very quickly, in the 4th millennium BC. So the early part of the Early Bronze I period sees still a sort of dispersed settlement organization that is mostly made of open villages and a higher degree of mobility than we should expect in the following period. And by this, I mean that there is a lesser degree of permanence at the site. Some of the major sites may be enclosed in this period and also include structures that can be interpreted as sanctuaries. So we may see in this, let's say, more mobile and less permanent pattern of open villages, the existence of regional centers that could be enclosed and that could be gathering centers for these communities. And then moving toward the later early Bronze 1 phases, we see something changes. What is the, I'll just go back for a second, what is the rounded architecture of the early Bronze 1 period leaves the way to rectangular dwellings and to the first attestation of fortifications at some early Bronze 1B sites. And what seems to be, together with this evidence for increasing complexity, an acceleration in agricultural produce. There is still a discussion on how much the early Bronze 2 period subsequently develops in continuity with this earlier phenomena. If we look at a map of the major early Bronze 2 sites attested in Transjordan, first of all, there are some clear changes in settlement patterns. Some early Bronze 1 sites are destroyed, possibly also by natural events. Some modern develop continuously, but we noticed in early Bronze 2 the trend towards the nucleation of fortified sites, the diffusion of massively fortified sites that are nucleated, and this mirrors, of course, a growing manipulation of the landscape through built environment and an acceleration in the management of agricultural produce that would fuel increasing commodification of crops. So to a certain extent, this develops from phenomenon started in the earlier periods, but it also faces us with the question whether that trajectory that we have seen in one of the early slides, you may have noticed that the traditional reconstruction of the developmental trajectory of the region, this trajectory is portrayed as a progression in a somewhat evolutionary way. So from early Bronze 1A to early Bronze 3, there is a continuous progression until the drop down in the early Bronze 4. So one of the open research questions is how much this reconstruction of a continuous trajectory of growth and success, despite some discontinuity, really reflects what was going on in the period. And this is something for future research to further investigate. So for today, though starting from this background, we will take early Bronze 2 as a starting point for looking at later developments, although some of the, I would not like to use the term elements of weakness, but maybe some of the developments of the more advanced early Bronze Age phases might be rooted in some imbalances that start already early in this period, already early in the 3rd millennium BC. If we have to characterize early Bronze 2 in Jordan through the lens of archaeological correlates, one element, as we said, is of course the presence of fortification and the nucleation of sites, but some of these sites also show evidence for what we may call non-residential compounds that clearly serve an extra-familial function and that are clearly dedicated to the storage of huge amount of crops, and that in some instances have sectors dedicated to production activities. The earliest one in Jordan are those of Tell Idea, and those are Khirbet Iskander, and that of Khirbet Iskander. These buildings have been defined variously by different authors. Some scholars have called them palaces, some others have called them proto-palaces, to stress that they served different purposes from just being residences, from just being dwellings. And this is also still an open question in the research about the early Bronze Age of the southern Levant and of Jordan in particular. As an example of what I mean for specialized production activities attached to these buildings, here there is the specialized oil production area and the public compound of Tell Idea. And this is also the time when taking the point of view of Jordan, we see for the first time buildings that have been interpreted as proper temples, referring mostly to what is a typically Southern Levantine tradition, but in some instances also showing more, let's say, complex sacred compounds. This is the case of Khirbet Iskander up here, where groups of temples, so the one clearly referring to the typical Southern Levantine tradition, but two others, according to me at least, pointing to reference to external foreign tradition of the sacred architecture. And in my interpretation, this may mean that sites that were located at important crossroads of interregional connectivity might have been again gathering places and interregional sanctuaries. So there's also, if we look more in depth at the evidence from this period, there is also evidence that the region was already included into intense interregional connectivity, possibly to an extent that is still a little bit overestimated in current literature. And this should be something to also investigate further in the future. Many early Bronze II sites are destroyed toward the end of the period by earthquakes, or earthquakes, and you can see here the list of sites that are terminated, maybe not just terminated, but where the early Bronze II occupation is terminated by a destruction. And some of them survived this destruction at the end of the early Bronze II period and continued into the early Bronze III. In many cases with the rebuild and the strengthening of the fortification systems. This is the case at Zeragon, of Batrawi, where gradually from the end of early Bronze II through early Bronze III, the fortification is tripled. This is the case of Khirbet Iskander, as we're going to see in a while. And in early Bronze III also, those non-residential compounds that we have seen for the previous period continue to be attested. One case is, again, the so-called Palace of Khirbet Iskander, at least for the initial early Bronze III phase, although the site will be later abandoned after circa 2800 BCE. And Susan Richard and I have suggested that another non-residential compound similar in function might be attested also at Khirbet Iskander, where in early Bronze III, a multi-room complex is built inside the fortifications on the northwest sector of the site, showing evidence for concentration of crops, so crop storage, different sort of goods and products, and of pottery production inside the building. So this building is slightly later chronologically than the one attested at Khirbet Iskander, and it is slightly earlier chronologically than the other building found at another site in Jordan, Khirbet al-Batrawi, and called by the excavator the Palace of the Copper Axe. Axe is for the discovery of metals inside the building. That is also consistent with the evidence from Khirbet Iskander because of the proof of pottery production inside the building once again. So reconsidering now the question with which one of the questions with which we have started this presentation. So whether the nature of the Southern Levantine society in the early Bronze Age was truly urban or not. I said before that my answer to this question is yes, and in my opinion that I will only really summarize in a nutshell, and this is also published in recent papers where I'm to which I'm referring you. It is really thanks to the higher chronology for the Southern Levantine early Bronze Age that we now may fully appreciate the scale of complexity reached by the Southern Levantine societies during this period, because the chronology for the Southern Levant has realigned early Bronze 2 and 3 in the Northern and Southern Levant. And this is clearly showing to us that an emerging urbanizing trend was contemporary in these regions during most of the first half of the 3rd millennium BC. And this is typified by a consistent set of archaeological correlates that include the fortifications, the presence of extrafamilial, non-residential building clearly dedicated to crop storage and to production activities, but the absence of writing and seemingly of complex administrative devices, accompanied by a broadly shared material culture traits that also suggest the extent of the interregional interactions of the Southern Levant with its neighbors during the first centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE. Moreover, early Bronze 3 in this region is also the time when for the period when for the first time copper in the Fainan district, in the Fainan district in the south, in the southern part of Transjordan, this copper was used already to a certain extent since the 4th millennium BC, but early Bronze 3 is the first time when this area is exploited on a commercial scale for trading ingots to outside the region. And this also is a further element, is a further piece of evidence of not just the scale of complexity reached by the Southern Levant and Jordan during early Bronze 3, but to the possible extent of the interregional and intraregional relationships that the region had already at that time. However, if we take a look at the early Bronze 3 in Jordan from a regional context, we notice that compared to that trajectory of continuous development from early Bronze 1A up to the early Bronze 3-4 transition, some differences are gradually coming into sharper focus. Either we re-examine older records, or we use fresh research to look at this question. In particular, the most important, it's not a new element, but element to start a reconsideration of the local developmental trajectories, that virtually all the early Bronze 3 fortified settlements in Jordan seems to have ceased before 2500 BC. Khirbet Iskander was abandoned before 2800 BC. The last occupation at Khirbet al-Batrawi, the one with the triple fortification line and the non-residential building, ends with a destruction around 2600 BC, C14 dated. Dates from Numeira and Babedra suggest that also the sites were possibly, the settlements at this site possibly ended before 2500 BC. We're going to see the trajectory of Khirbet Iskander that is slightly different from the ones of the site that we are just listed. Differently, in Cisjordan, fortified sites, or at least some fortified settlements, seems to have lasted at least until 2500 BC. And this is the case, for instance, of Megiddo and Yarmouz, with their non-residential buildings that are virtually unanimously recognized as palaces. This is important because even since when Jordan has been fitted into current regional narratives for the Southern Levantine early Bronze Age, there has been the notion that the scale of the developments reached by this region was a little bit lesser than the one reached by Cisjordan, especially if we compare the so-called palaces of Megiddo and Yarmouz to the non-residential buildings of the early Bronze 2-3 period that we have seen for the sites, the early Bronze 2 and 3 sites in Transjordan. And in my opinion, this is really just based on a matter of chronology. This chronological difference is the key to reinvestigate the differences between Transjordan and Cisjordan during the late Early Bronze III period and at the time of the Early Bronze III to IV transition. Discontinuity and intermittency in settled life at the fortified sites between Early Bronze II and III and throughout Early Bronze III has been used by several scholars to frame local urbanism within instability and to portray EB3 as a phase of progressive decline that would eventually lead to an adaptation of the communities residing in the walled settlements to more mobile lifeways and subsistence strategies. According to some models, this reorientation would have allowed the southern Levantine communities to enter the orbit of the northern Levantine polities through their participation in large-scale pastoral exploitation of the steppe that supported the economy of the nascent early states of Syria. Although we have seen that there are also models supporting a wider, stronger permanence of urban-like traits, at least at the sedentary sites, this notion that elements from Syria were critical to reshaping the material culture of the non-urban period is a persistent trait of many interpretative constructs. For the last part of this presentation, I would use this wider introduction to developments in the early Bronze Age in Jordan to reinvestigate the question of the early Bronze III-IV nexus through the lens of recent research at Khirbet Iskander. What I would like to test with you is whether these unifying narratives of developments in the region may really apply to a regional scale, or if developments and changes within periods and between periods were more differentiated at individual sites and areas. Khirbet Iskander, despite the name, is a proper tell, as you can see in the photograph. It is located in southern central Jordan, on the northern bank of the Wadi al-Wala and next to the King's Highway. The site has been investigated since 1981 by Suzanne Richard, joined by Jesse Long in 1994, and then by myself also since 2015. And it is better known as a signature site for the non-urban early Bronze IV period, but recent research is suggesting that it must have been an important site also during early Bronze III, and possibly already since early Bronze II. The site was fortified as early as early Bronze II, and this first settlement was destroyed, possibly by an earthquake, like many other sites in Jordan, as we have seen before, and as you can see on the slide. But it was rebuilt soon after, either at the early Bronze II-III cusp or in the very early Bronze III phase. You see the new fortification line here, and this fortification line was then strengthened and rebuilt several times during early Bronze III. This is the phase that the more advanced stages within the still early phase within the early Bronze III. So we are in the first half of the early Bronze III period. We are before 2700 BCE, so to speak. It is when the non-residential building is also erected inside the fortifications on the northwest sector of the site. Here you see some more of the evidence for crop storage and for production activities. Also, this stratum at the site terminates with a fierce destruction. You can see this from some of the images. And we encountered, this is from area B where the non-residential building is, but we encountered this destruction in all the main excavation areas. So this is area C, the bottom of a sondage at the end of the 2022 season, where we think that we have identified traces of this massive destruction. That we can place ceramically still during a let's say, toward the end of an early Bronze III phases. Within traditional chronology, this would be early Bronze III A. And this is also supported by C14 dates, although still unpublished, that suggest that this event should not have happened too much after 2700 BCE at the latest. This event, the notion that the evidence that the early Bronze III fortified settlement with a multi-room compound that we may describe as non-residential, as let's say more in the broadest possible sense, public, terminates before 2700 BCE at Khirbet Iskander, raises the end of the fortified of the urban settlement at Khirbet Iskander before 2500 BCE, or saying it in other words, anticipates the crisis of the fortified settlements at this site too, like at the other sites in Jordan that we have very quickly seen before. However, differently from other sites that experienced a different trajectory and maybe had an abandonment after the EB3 occupation, either temporarily or permanently, Khirbet Iskander was settled continuously, all through the remainder of the early Bronze III period and into EB4. I'm not going to delve deep into this. I just want to give you an impressionistic idea of what the new discoveries suggested to us in terms of the early Bronze III-IV transition at this site. In the first place, a new massive wall was built in the northwest sector of the site, much wider than the previous fortifications, but also much coarser, suggesting for the community's urgent needs for protection in a time of crisis, still during early Bronze III, but after the destruction. And this wall may have been used also in the early Bronze IV phase. But on the eastern sector of the site, domestic occupation was continuous all through the remainder of the early Bronze III, and it is C14 date. This is the sondage, and those are the dates that we recently published in radiocarbon. And again, I'm not going to describe all of these phases, but this is just to show you, and you see the absolute chronologies that goes with each and one of these phases above the photographs, and you see from the pottery that all these phases are still can still be placed within a definite early Bronze III chronological horizon. These three phases simply document continuity of domestic occupation at the site all through the remainder of the early Bronze III, despite what seems possibly an initial phase of crisis, and then progressive reorganization, the quality of the architecture, although the exposure is still little to say more than that, the quality, this building seems to be of a poorer, coarser quality than the pre-destruction phases. But still, what we can draw from this sequence is that the crisis of the fortified settlement started before 2500 BCE, but the community, rather than redispersing and reverting to a different economy and subsistence strategies, stayed on the mound and as a sedentary group. This sequence is taught by what we have interpreted as possibly the early Bronze IV phase. You can see it here. This is the last early Bronze III phase, and this is already the surface of the first early Bronze IV phase. And the material culture of this phase, rather than being a hybrid material culture infused by Syrian influxes, is represented by an impoverished EB3-ish ceramic repertoire. And this evidence is consistent with every other site, not just in Jordan, but more generally in the southern Levant, where a post-urban phase that can be ascribed to a chronology between the end of the 26th century and the very early 25th century BC has been identified. This is also the period, or at least this is the interpretation that I think could be given to the evidence we are looking at when permanent settlement, or let's say visible settlement, seems to cluster along the Jordan Valley and the Eastern Dead Sea Plain. New foundations, either from scratch or after a gap, after several centuries, can be found along the Jordan Valley, or previous fortified sites are still inhabited and might have also absorbed people coming from other sites that were abandoned. And actually, this seems to be a phase where climatic conditions were a little bit drier than they would be in the remainder of the early Bronze 4 period. So what I'm suggesting is that we are looking at a more opportunistic use of the landscape toward the 25th century BC, where these communities are looking for ecological niches that would be more capable of sustaining subsistence strategies. If we look at developments at Khirbet Iskander in the following early Bronze 4 phases, we clearly see that the advanced phases of the period are characterized clearly by what is, at least in my view, a complete refoundation of the village with a new plan and with evidence for public, again, in the widest, in the broadest possible sense, buildings over several phases. You here see the evidence from the two main excavated areas. And again, this is consistent with the evidence from the rest of the region, where the spread, the diffusion of a permanent sedentary sites testifies to the rejuvenation of a flourishing web of innovative village communities living on a mixed economy and involved in intense regional interactions that we may describe as a rural regeneration. And this is the phase where clearly some sectors of the economy that had been pivotal already in the urban period are still lively. The recent research by James Fraser at sites like Khirbet Ghozlan, are clearly showing that there was a segment of the local economy and subsistence strategies that was still grounded in arboriculture and in olive oil production. And in my opinion, this would fuel both intra-regional interactions, upland, lowland interactions, and possibly also interregional interactions, especially at the interface areas between the northern and southern Levant, with stopping points on the plateau. But this is just to say that this is a time when also arboriculture seems to have played a very important role in the economy of the early Bronze 4 village communities in Jordan, or at least in some regions of Jordan, and this might have fueled intra-regional connectivity to a certain extent. This is also the time when interregional connectivity is clearly attested. The advanced early Bronze 4 phases are those when there is a resurgence in the use and the commercial use, in the use of and the exploitation at a commercial scale of the copper in the Fainan region. And here you see the directions of the distribution of copper ingots toward the west, northwest, and toward the north. These different routes of regional and interregional connectivities are also the means through which technological and technostylistic information traveled across the region. The pottery is completely different. I'm not going to delve into this, but if you compare, ideally, these vessels that come from Khirbet Iskander in the advanced early Bronze 4 phase with the ones that we've seen before from the early Bronze 4 phase, you clearly see that there's been an incredible technological change. And it is likely, to me at least, that also individuals were moving along with ideas and technology across the region. Human non-residential mobility, either intra-regional or interregional, was clearly a key element of the rejuvenation of the early Bronze Fourth society in the southern Levant and in Jordan during the advanced early Bronze Fourth phases. As we moved toward the final phases of the periods, and by this I'm not talking absolute chronology, I'm referring to the stratigraphy of the sites that have long sequences for the early Bronze Fourth period. We also notice the appearance of some forerunners of the Middle Bronze Age ceramic tradition of the following period. But the problem is that there is no C14 dates associated with those late early Bronze Fourth stages in the region, and that there is no settlement continuity with maybe a few exceptions, but there's virtually no settlement continuity at sites with a late early Bronze Fourth phase and an early Middle Bronze Fourth phase. You can see this in the map. These two yellow spots are the most well-known early Middle Bronze one sites in the region, and most of the major early Bronze Fourth sites are abandoned and are not settled in the following period. I'll tell in a moment what I do think is the most obvious consequence in terms of interpretation of this evidence for lack of evidence for a stratigraphic nexus between the two periods. So moving toward the conclusions and trying to answer to the initial question, how does Jordan fit into current regional narratives of the Southern Levantine early Bronze Age, and starting from the earliest phases within the periods that we have analyzed more in depth. We have said that there's clearly an intensification of the agricultural production and an acceleration in social complexity that we can place somewhere in the last centuries of the fourth millennium BC, and that it is still an open question how much this development influence, or more appropriately, whether these developments influenced in a positive or affected in a positive or negative way the developments of the following centuries. This is something that should be investigated more in depth. But if we take 3100 or 3000 BC as a starting point for our analysis of the proper urban trajectory of Jordan, we may say that the region progressed in a parallel way to Cisjordan, at least during the first centuries of the third millennium BC, and then developed differently in the rest of the early Bronze III period and until 2500 BC. The economic acceleration that we see in early Bronze II and in the early Bronze III possibly put too much stress on a landscape that was characterized by fragile ecologies that were sensitive to minimal climatic and environmental changes that might have been critical to the failure of subsistence strategies. From circa 2700 BCE, then, the local trajectory revolved around the generalized earlier crisis of urbanism that was followed by diversified subregional adaptive responses during the subsequent centuries of the early Bronze III until 2500 BCE that would gradually lead the region to the transition from early Bronze III to IV. And actually, the demise of urbanism was an irreversible process that took quite some time to happen, and that happened with a different pace at individual sites and areas between 2700 and 2500 BC. As a consequence, the later early Bronze III may have been a time of crisis of urbanism that might have been followed by continuous occupation at certain sites like Khirbet Iskander that acted like refugia, and by resettlements in other areas during the early Bronze IV phases. And to me, the best way to describe this early phase of the early Bronze 4, and the response, the adaptive response to such crises, is through habitat tracking and population shifts between the terminal early Bronze 3 and the late early Bronze, and the terminal early Bronze 3 and the early Bronze 4. That this was a winning option is clearly demonstrated by the rejuvenation of a flourishing web of innovative village community in the more advanced phases of the early Bronze 4 period that were capable of intense intraregional interactions and that were also fully drawn into interregional connectivity. It is clear from the evidence that we have, albeit very quickly, seen that the classic before was a flourishing phase of developed sedentary communities that were living on a mixed agripastoral economy, and that were possibly also actively engaging with more mobile components, that were controlling some specialized segments of production activities, metallurgy, and more generally technology, although the extent of these contacts and how much they happen on a regular basis still eludes us, because we are not yet capable of seeing such more mobile communities outside the desertic and marginal areas. And this is the last question. To what extent some of the seeds of the following urban regeneration that would start from the 19th century BC might have been sown in the last early Bronze 4 phase is still debated. There are few radiocarbon dates for the advanced early Bronze 4 phases within long stratigraphic sequences, and none of them span the last centuries of the third millennium BC. In other words, it is currently impossible to observe the stratigraphic nexus between the early Bronze 4 and the Middle Bronze 1. At the site excavated thus far, there are no continuous early Bronze 4 into Middle Bronze 1 sequences. So although it might be a chance, there might be the chance, it might be possible that this nexus was accompanied by some shifts in patterns of settlements in this region. To prove this and to understand what were the dynamics that would lead the region to the transition from the third to the second millennium BC and from the early Bronze 4 period to the Middle Bronze 1 period, it's still obscure. And therefore, also the last centuries of the third millennium BCE are still an open research question. How much we can extend the picture that I've just portrayed to the last centuries of the third millennium BCE is something that still awaits for more research and for more C14 dated phases at individual sites and stratigraphies and material culture to fit the gap that we have, and this will be hopefully the task for future research to answer this open question. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marta. Really, thank you very much, because I really loved your presentation. Your brilliant presentation has been, at least to me, illuminating on a number of topics that I think are of general interest, not only for Jordan, but let's say theoretical issues that are actually, I think, of interest for anyone studying the archaeology of the Levant and more in general the archaeology of the Near East. So first of all, I have to stop the record of this presentation, and then